So in a previous video, I spoke about refeeding syndrome and starvation in animals. And I mentioned these animals are usually in humane societies and rescue groups and shelters and things like that. Well, this reminds me of how often in my daily holistic practice, I talk about adrenal glands, like adrenal fatigue, adrenal burnout, adrenal insufficiency, stress burnout, sympathetic overdrive, all these things that happen to people and pets. So I first learned about the adrenal glands, if you're not familiar with them. I learned about them in a wildlife biology course, undergraduate, before I even went to vet school. And the story I remember was some wildlife biologist was doing research on squirrels or something like that. And they were trapping squirrels to do whatever they were doing. And they were finding the squirrels were dying within a few minutes in the traps. And long story short, they figured out it was their adrenaline, that fight or flight shot of adrenaline that we get when we're scared and we have to run for our lives. That adrenaline was so strong, it was causing their little hearts to literally explode because they were so stressed out about being in the trap. So that's a bummer. Well, but that happens to all of us, all creatures living in the modern world. We have these adrenal glands that are intended, designed, evolved, created, whatever, to help you respond to a true life or death situation. Adrenaline, made by the adrenal glands, is called the fight or flight hormone. And it's intended to be used, hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago when we were being chased by saber-toothed tigers or whatever. Or maybe today you would use it if your kid or your dog runs into traffic, or you have to lift a car off of somebody in a car accident. But those things don't happen very often in our modern world. We don't have a big need for our adrenaline that often anymore. So, in fact, aside from the squirrel or rodent trapped in a cage, which, by the way, is probably the same feeling that the shelter dogs and cats have locked in a cage in a shelter with all the dogs barking. Aside from that, in the modern world, we humans and our pets, we're faced with so little true life or death, fight or flight danger that we don't get to use our adrenaline often enough. That's why you see people who are adrenaline junkies. It's not just the adrenaline junkies like base jumpers and flight suit guys and bungee jumpers, but it's also so much of our modern environment. So much of our TV and movies are based on horror, or they're just super aggressive behaviors, or they're violent. I mean, the most popular TV shows are really violent, way more violent than they used to be. And that's either because we've just become numbed out to it with all the video games and all the prior violence on TV. But I think part of it's because we're no longer interested, we as a group of TV watching modern industrialized people, we're not interested in gentle shows. We need to see the violence and the aggression because it brings out or uses up some of our own adrenaline, and we just don't get to use that on a regular basis. So in nature, the way we're intended, we would be using our adrenaline at least once a day or a few times a week, maybe, for life and death, fight or flight situations, being chased by some wild animal or trying to cross a raging river or something. But we don't get to do that anymore. So the other side of the adrenal glands, they make several hormones, but the two biggest, most important ones, especially for stress that people are familiar with, adrenaline, which we kind of covered. The other one's cortisol. Cortisol is your long-term stress hormone. So this is for things like you can't find food, or you're living through the winter, or you're having to migrate somewhere else, things like that. And that's to be used kind of once a year, and it's a low-level background thing. But in our modern world, it's the opposite. We're not using our adrenaline a few times a week. We're using it not at all. And instead of using our cortisol once or twice a year for some long-term, low-level, maybe a few weeks before we find food, or we have to move to some other place to live, and we don't know where that's going to be or where we're going to end up, and we're a little worried about that. That's cortisol. But instead, in our modern world, our cortisol is up all the time, way higher than it's intended to be, and just all the time, every day. This is the stuff, the constant background, everyday stress. It's what's happening to everybody here. We all know it. People and pets. It's work. It's school. It's kids. It's traffic. It's money. Wars. Negative news cycle. Finances. It's everything in the modern world that we're exposed to that we're not designed to be exposed to. So our cortisol is up way higher than it should be all the time. And long-term cortisol is a steroid, long-term cortisol just causes all these other problems. So back to where I began, the refeeding syndrome starvation case. So this starvation dog is kind of a good example of both sides of that. On one hand, his body is physically stressed. from digesting his own fats and proteins and starving to death. His body is under physical stress. The adrenal glands are used in that, and maybe they're used up because he's been under that physical stress for a long time and they're just fatigued and worn out. The other thing is he's under psychological stress, not just physical, but psychological. That's like the emotional. That's what we usually think of when we as humans talk about stress. It's the drama, it's the tension, it's the emotional, it's the psychological stuff. When we use the word stress, we're rarely talking about physical stress. Physical stress, is car wreck trauma and, severe illness and ultra runners who aren't training properly and their bodies and bones and joints are undergoing too much physical stress. That is adrenal gland stuff too, but what happens in our modern world is more psychological and fear and drama. And part of what I said earlier about all the things in your daily life, that have you stressed, that's the negative news cycle. Everything is fear-based that you see on TV or the news or on social media. There's going to be World War III, or some pandemic's going to kill us, or the Iranians are going to kill us, or the North Koreans, or the Chinese, or the Russians, or the economy is going to kill us, or the political parties are going to kill us, or there's going to be a civil war, or the housing market's going to crash. Everything's just negative, and you're constantly stressed. Same thing for the dogs. So these dogs that came from shelter environments, they, what happened to them on the streets before they got to the shelter? They were starved, or they couldn't find food, or they were scared, or people were kicking them, or cars were scaring them, or they were trapped outside in thunderstorms, couldn't get away, or whatever. Then they go into the shelter environment and they're in a cage, just like that squirrel. They're trapped in a cage and they can't escape. They can't run and hide under a bed. They can't run and hide under a dumpster. They can't just run up an alley and get away from the people and the cars and things that are scary. They're in there, and all the other dogs are barking their heads off, and it's noisy and it's echoey, and there's strange people going by, and people are forcing medication down their mouth or forcing vaccines into them, and they don't know what's going on, and they're scared. So they're physically stressed, and now they're psychologically stressed. A lot of the animals I see are rescued animals. They came from that environment, and maybe it's years later, but they've had a lifetime of being afraid of thunderstorms and fireworks and noises and broom handles and men's voices and just all these things. They're fearful and they don't respond properly. They either hide and freak out, or they overreact because they don't know how to respond properly. That's a problem. That's another way we look at adrenal fatigue, especially in people. If your adrenals are burnt out, since your adrenals are your stress response, whether it's adrenaline or cortisol, if they're burnt out or out of balance or overworked, it's not just that you can't respond to stress, it's that you don't properly respond to stress. So these are people that just lose it. This is road rage. This is, screaming at a cashier somewhere who really didn't do anything wrong. This is you can't properly respond. And the dogs are the same way. Something somewhat unknown happens outside, like a leaf blows by, or the wind's blowing, or there's a dumpster, or there's a motorcycle. They're terrified because they don't know how to properly respond to it. That's all adrenal fatigue, people and pets. So, to my point, I'm often recommending adrenal support supplements. And there's a company I like, and there's a brand I like, and that's what I recommend to a lot of people. And I'm going to recommend it if you or your pets are feeling this way, because I'd say more than half, maybe even 3/4, a whole lot of my patients and clients do have an underlying stress issue, whether it's in their current life because they're not getting exposed to things they should in nature, or whether it's from their previous shelter life. It could go either way. So in nature, or hundreds of thousands of years ago, paleo man and indigenous cultures, or if your animal was out in the wild feeding himself on killing something and eating it, we would have the instinctive craving to eat the adrenal glands if we were stressed. So if we had adrenal fatigue or our adrenal glands were having trouble, we'd eat the adrenal glands of another animal. We would just know that instinctively, intuitively, and your pets would know that. But we don't have that opportunity in our modern world where we eat processed food and man-made food. And even the animals eating raw food probably aren't eating adrenal glands because it's commercially prepared raw food, which I'm a fan of, and I feed that to my dogs, but it doesn't have absolutely everything in it like these glands. So the adrenal glands, they have copper and zinc, selenium, and enzymes, and all these things in them that make the hormones. You can't just supplement the hormones. You've got to supplement the whole gland so the gland can rebuild itself with all its building blocks and enzymes and minerals and everything it needs, okay? So I use like the standard process products like here. I use the adrenal desiccate, which is this dried up adrenal gland, feed it to the animals for a few weeks, It's just the same as restoring their adrenal glands if they were eating adrenals of another animal. It's got everything in it, the enzymes, the tissue, the minerals, everything you need to make the hormones properly. And after a few weeks or a few months of that, I switched to this one, the Adrenamin, which is more focused on vitamins and minerals and other things that the adrenal glands would use to make their hormones. So it's like a support. So that's what I use for these animals, and I think it's really good. And it's just an instinctive, intuitive thing. Also, the adrenal. Last thing about the adrenal is think about all the diseases that are associated with adrenal issues or adrenal insufficiency. This is Cushing's syndrome, Addison's disease, low blood pressure, or postural hypotension. When you stand up too quickly and you're lightheaded or you're woozy because your blood pressure doesn't come up fast enough when you stand up, that's adrenal gland. That's adrenal stress fatigue. So I use the adrenal desiccated and the Adrenamin for these things, and there you have it. Thanks. Bye.